What if a single act of kindness could expose a decades-old conspiracy that destroyed lives and built empires? When a decorated war veteran was humiliated and thrown out of a hospital cafeteria for not being able to pay for a meal, she never imagined that 24 hours later, 3 gleaming Rolls-Royces would arrive at her doorstep, carrying a billionaire who owed her everything. In the sprawling medical complex of Denver General, where corporate greed masquerades as healthcare and human dignity is measured in insurance premiums, one woman's courage under fire would uncover a web of betrayal that reached the highest levels of American business. Can you forgive someone who built their fortune on your sacrifice while you lost everything defending your country? Denver, Colorado, a city where snow-capped mountains frame gleaming skyscrapers, and where the promise of the American West meets the harsh realities of modern healthcare. The mile-high metropolis where fortunes are made in boardrooms while heroes are forgotten. In the shadows of progress, Sarah Martinez stood at the entrance of Denver General Hospital, her worn military surplus jacket offering little protection against the October wind that cut through the downtown streets like a knife. At 38, her weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who had worked every day since returning from Afghanistan 7 years ago, yet her dark eyes still held the alert intensity of a soldier who had seen too much and forgotten nothing. The slight limp in her left leg, a permanent reminder of the IED that had ended her military career, barely slowed her determined stride as she approached the building where she had worked the night shift as a trauma nurse for the past 3 years. The imposing glass and steel structure of Denver General rose 15 stories into the Colorado sky, its modern facade gleaming with the kind of architectural confidence that came from unlimited funding and corporate backing. Chrome letters spelling out Meridian Healthcare Systems dominated the building's entrance, a reminder that this hospital, like so many others across the country, had been absorbed into the expanding empire of America's largest private healthcare conglomerate. Sarah had watched the transformation with growing unease over the past 18 months, as patient care gradually took a backseat to profit margins, and dedicated medical professionals were replaced by cost-cutting administrators who had never seen the inside of an operating room. This particular morning felt different from the countless others when Sarah had walked through those automatic doors. There was a tension in the air, a sense that change was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The early shift nurses moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to do more with less. Their conversations hushed and their expressions guarded. Budget cuts had eliminated positions, increased workloads, and created an atmosphere where job security was a luxury none of them could afford. Sarah had survived longer than most, partly because of her medical training from the army, but mostly because she was willing to work harder and longer than anyone else to ensure her patients received the care they deserved. The trauma wing on the 4th floor had become Sarah's domain, a place where her military training in battlefield medicine translated into life-saving skills in civilian healthcare. She had earned the respect of doctors and fellow nurses through her calm competence under pressure, her ability to function without sleep for dangerous stretches of time, and her unwavering commitment to treating every patient as if they were family. Her colleagues knew better than to question her methods when she broke minor hospital policies to ensure a homeless veteran received proper care, or when she stayed hours past her shift to comfort a dying patient who had no family. In a system increasingly driven by metrics and efficiency ratings, Sarah represented something that couldn't be quantified: genuine compassion backed by unshakable competence. The morning briefing revealed what Sarah had suspected was coming. For weeks, Janet Morrison, the floor supervisor who had been with Denver General for 12 years, gathered the nursing staff in the small break room that doubled as their meeting space. Morrison's usually warm demeanor was strained, her voice carefully controlled as she delivered the news that would reshape their professional lives. 3 more nursing positions were being eliminated effective immediately. Patient-to-nurse ratios were being increased beyond what most medical professionals considered safe, and several departments were being consolidated to maximize efficiency and minimize operational costs. Sarah listened with the same focused attention she had once reserved for military briefings, noting the carefully chosen corporate language that transformed human beings into cost centers and transformed healing into profit optimization. She recognized the signs of an organization preparing for something larger, the kind of systematic restructuring that preceded major changes in ownership or operational philosophy. Having served in Afghanistan during the height of American involvement, she understood how institutions could transform almost overnight when new leadership decided that previous methods were no longer economically viable. The implications of these changes extended far beyond mere inconvenience or increased workload. Sarah had seen what happened when medical facilities operated with insufficient staff and resources, how quickly patient safety could be compromised when healthcare workers were pushed beyond their limits. She thought of the elderly veterans who depended on Denver General for their care, many of whom had served their country with the same dedication she had, only to find themselves navigating a healthcare system that seemed designed to extract maximum profit while providing minimum care. The irony was not lost on her that she and her fellow veterans had sworn to defend a nation that now seemed more interested in their financial value than their fundamental humanity. As the meeting concluded and nurses dispersed to begin their shifts, Sarah found herself thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. The transition from military service to civilian life had been more challenging than she had anticipated, not because of physical limitations from her combat injury, but because of the stark difference in values between the military culture she had embraced and the civilian world she was expected to navigate. In the Army, the mission had always been clear: protect your fellow soldiers, accomplish the objective, and never leave anyone behind. The corporate healthcare environment operated according to different principles, where efficiency metrics often took precedence over patient outcomes, and where the bottom line determined the level of care that could be provided. Denver General had initially felt like a place where she could continue serving, where her skills and dedication could make a meaningful difference in people's lives. The trauma wing attracted the most serious cases, the kind of life and death situations where her military training proved invaluable. She had found purpose in being the steady presence that patients and families could depend on during their darkest moments, the professional who would fight for them when they were too vulnerable to fight for themselves. Working alongside dedicated doctors and experienced nurses, she had believed she had found a way to honor her military service while building a meaningful civilian career. The gradual changes at Denver General had been subtle at first, barely noticeable shifts in policy and procedure that individually seemed reasonable but collectively pointed toward a fundamental transformation in the hospital's mission. Equipment purchases were delayed or cancelled. Staffing levels were adjusted downward in the name of efficiency, and patient care protocols were modified to reduce costs rather than improve outcomes. Sarah had watched with growing concern as the institution she had come to respect was slowly reshaped according to corporate priorities that seemed to have little connection to the actual practice of medicine. Her fellow nurses had responded to these changes in various ways, some accepting them as inevitable aspects of modern healthcare, others expressing frustration privately while continuing to do their jobs professionally. Sarah had chosen a different approach, quietly documenting instances where cost-cutting measures had compromised patient care, building relationships with patients and families who might not otherwise have advocates within the system, and using Her position to ensure that corporate policies didn't prevent individuals from receiving the medical attention they needed. This approach had earned her the gratitude of patients and the grudging respect of administrators, but it had also placed her in an increasingly precarious position as healthcare became more tightly regulated by financial considerations. The morning shift proceeded with the familiar rhythm of organized chaos that characterized trauma nursing, but Sarah could sense the additional stress created by reduced staffing and increased responsibilities. Nurses moved between patients with practiced efficiency, but the margin for error had been eliminated, and the emotional toll of providing care under such constraints was visible in their faces. Sarah found herself taking on additional responsibilities, covering for colleagues who were stretched beyond their limits and making split-second decisions about patient care that should have been made by teams of medical professionals working together. By mid-morning, Sarah had already treated a construction worker with severe lacerations from a workplace accident, assisted with the emergency surgery of a car accident victim, and provided comfort to the family of an elderly patient whose condition had deteriorated overnight. Each interaction reinforced her conviction that healthcare should be about healing and human dignity rather than profit maximization, but also reminded her of how vulnerable people became when they were dependent on institutions that might not prioritize their well-being above financial considerations. As lunchtime approached, Sarah realized she had been working for 6 hours without a break, subsisting on the coffee and adrenaline that had sustained her through countless demanding shifts. The hospital cafeteria represented one of the few spaces where medical staff could briefly escape the intensity of patient care, a place where doctors, nurses, and support staff could decompress and connect with colleagues who understood the unique stresses of healthcare work. Sarah had always appreciated these brief interludes, not just for the opportunity to eat and rest, but for the chance to maintain the human connections that made the demanding work sustainable over time. The walk to the cafeteria took her through corridors that had once felt familiar and welcoming, but now seemed marked by the subtle signs of cost-cutting and corporate efficiency. Maintenance had been reduced, creating an atmosphere of gradual decay that patients and families couldn't help but notice. Staff reductions meant that the personal touch that had once characterized Denver General was being replaced by the sterile efficiency of a business operation focused primarily on financial performance. Sarah noticed these changes with the observational skills she had developed during military service, recognizing patterns that others might miss and understanding their implications for the institution's future direction. The hospital cafeteria occupied the entire second floor of Denver General's East Wing, a sprawling space designed to accommodate the hundreds of medical professionals, support staff, visitors and patients who needed meals throughout the day. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling streets of downtown Denver, where office workers hurried past homeless encampments that had become a permanent fixture of the urban landscape. The irony was not lost on Sarah that she could see both the gleaming corporate towers where healthcare decisions were made and the tent cities where those decisions played out in human terms. Sarah had always found the cafeteria to be a microcosm of the hospital's social hierarchy, with distinct seating areas that reflected the unspoken divisions between doctors, nurses, administrators, and support staff. The physicians typically gathered near the windows, their conversations focused on complex cases and the latest medical research. Nurses clustered around tables in the center, sharing the kind of gallows humor that helped them cope with the emotional weight of their work. Administrative staff occupied the quieter corners, their discussions revolving around budgets, policies, and the endless stream of directives from Meridian Healthcare's corporate headquarters. The food service operation had undergone significant changes since Meridian's acquisition of Denver General 18 months earlier. What had once been a traditional hospital cafeteria with reasonable prices and decent quality had been transformed into a profit center that charged premium prices for mediocre food. The previous management had subsidized meals for staff and patients, recognizing that adequate nutrition was essential for healing and that healthcare workers needed affordable options during their long shifts. Meridian had eliminated these subsidies as part of their cost-cutting initiatives, arguing that the cafeteria should operate as a self-sustaining business unit rather than a service provided to the hospital community. Sarah approached the serving line with the same methodical patience she brought to all aspects of her work, scanning the available options while calculating costs against her limited budget. Her Army disability compensation provided a modest monthly income, but the majority of her earnings came from her nursing salary, which had been frozen for the past year despite increasing workload and responsibilities. The combination of rising living costs in Denver and stagnant wages meant that every financial decision required careful consideration, especially discretionary spending like cafeteria meals that she could theoretically avoid by bringing food from home. The serving staff recognized Sarah as a regular customer, someone who always treated them with respect and never complained about prices or quality, despite having obvious reasons to do so. Maria Gonzalez, who had worked in the cafeteria for 8 years and had witnessed the transformation under Meridian's management, often saved Sarah the better portions when possible and occasionally found ways to reduce her bill through employee discounts that were technically reserved for full-time administrative staff. These small acts of kindness represented the human connections that made the increasingly corporate environment tolerable for people who had chosen healthcare as a calling rather than merely a career. Today's lunch selection reflected the cost-cutting measures that had been implemented throughout the hospital, with fewer options and smaller portions designed to maximize profit margins while meeting minimal nutritional requirements. Sarah selected a simple turkey sandwich, a small container of soup, and a bottle of water, creating a meal that would provide adequate sustenance without straining her budget. She had learned to view food as fuel rather than pleasure, an attitude developed during military service and reinforced by the financial realities of civilian life as a healthcare worker in an increasingly expensive city. The cashier was someone Sarah didn't recognize, a young man who appeared to be new to the position and uncertain about the various pricing policies and discount structures that had evolved over time. His name tag identified him as Kevin, and his nervous demeanor suggested he was still learning the complex system of charges, exemptions, and special rates that governed cafeteria operations. Sarah approached the register with her usual patience, understanding that training new employees in a cost-cutting environment often meant they were thrown into positions without adequate preparation or support. Kevin rang up Sarah's items with careful attention to the price list taped beside the register, his movements deliberate as he navigated the computerized system that tracked every transaction for corporate analysis. The total came to $18.47, a price that reflected the premium rates Meridian had implemented across all hospital services. Sarah reached for her wallet, a worn leather piece she had carried since her military service, and counted out the bills and coins that represented a significant portion of her daily discretionary spending. As she counted her money, Sarah realized with growing embarrassment that she was $3.12 short of the total amount due. The combination of recent car repairs, an unexpected medical bill from her own healthcare needs, and the general erosion of purchasing power had left her finances more strained than she had calculated. She looked at Kevin apologetically, explaining that she would need to remove some items from her purchase to bring the total within her available budget. Kevin appeared uncomfortable with the situation, glancing around nervously as if seeking guidance from more experienced staff members who were busy with other customers. The cafeteria's policy regarding insufficient funds was unclear to him, and he seemed uncertain about whether he had the authority to modify prices or remove items from transactions. Sarah offered to put back the soup and water, keeping only the sandwich, but even that adjustment would leave her slightly short of the required amount. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Janet Morrison, the nursing supervisor who had conducted the morning briefing about staff reductions and policy changes. Morrison had been observing the interaction from across the cafeteria and approached the register with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she intended to resolve the situation quickly and definitively. Her expression was stern, reflecting the stress of managing nursing operations under increasingly difficult circumstances while dealing with corporate pressure to eliminate any inefficiencies or irregularities. Morrison's intervention transformed what had been a simple financial miscalculation into something far more serious and personally humiliating for Sarah. Rather than offering assistance or suggesting alternatives, Morrison questioned Sarah's financial management and professional competence in a voice loud enough to attract attention from nearby tables. She suggested that someone responsible for life-and-death medical decisions should be capable of managing their personal finances well enough to afford a simple lunch, and wondered aloud whether financial instability might indicate broader problems. With judgment and reliability, the public nature of Morrison's criticism created an atmosphere of uncomfortable tension throughout the immediate area, with other diners trying to appear disinterested while obviously listening to every word of the exchange. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of hypervigilance that had once kept her alive in combat zones, an acute awareness of her surroundings and the reactions of everyone within sight. The difference was that in Afghanistan, she had been surrounded by fellow soldiers who would support her in dangerous situations, while in the hospital cafeteria, she was isolated and vulnerable to professional and personal attack. Morrison's criticism escalated when she suggested that Sarah's presence in the cafeteria without adequate funds reflected poorly on the nursing staff's professionalism and might create problems with cafeteria operations if other employees began expecting special treatment or payment flexibility. She implied that someone who couldn't afford the standard meal prices should consider bringing food from home rather than creating uncomfortable situations for food service workers and other customers. The suggestion carried undertones of class-based judgment that struck Sarah as particularly cruel, given her military service and dedication to patient care. Sarah attempted to defuse the situation by explaining that she would simply skip lunch and return to work, but Morrison interpreted this as an inadequate response to what she characterized as a broader pattern of poor decision-making. She questioned whether someone experiencing financial difficulties might be susceptible to other pressures that could compromise their professional judgment, suggesting that Sarah's personal circumstances warranted closer supervision and possible disciplinary action. The implication that financial hardship indicated character flaws or professional incompetence revealed Morrison's fundamental misunderstanding of the economic realities facing many healthcare workers. The confrontation reached its climax when Morrison declared that Sarah was disrupting cafeteria operations and creating an uncomfortable environment for other customers and staff members. She demanded that Sarah leave the cafeteria immediately and suggested that she should consider whether her continued employment at Denver General was appropriate given what Morrison characterized as ongoing problems with professional conduct and personal responsibility. The threat was unmistakable, delivered in the kind of authoritative tone that supervisors used when they wanted to establish dominance and discourage further resistance. Sarah's military training had taught her to maintain composure under extreme stress, to function effectively even when facing hostile fire or impossible odds. But the public humiliation in the hospital cafeteria, surrounded by colleagues and patients who witnessed her being treated as if she were a disruptive vagrant, rather than a dedicated healthcare professional, tested her emotional control in ways that combat had not. The injustice of being criticized for financial limitations while working in an institution that prioritized profit over human dignity created an anger that she struggled to contain while maintaining her professional demeanor. The walk from the cafeteria register to the exit felt like the longest distance Sarah had ever covered, with every step observed by people who would remember this incident and incorporate it into their understanding of her character and professional competence. She maintained her dignity through sheer force of will, keeping her expression neutral and her movements controlled, despite the internal turmoil that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The automatic doors that had welcomed her into the hospital that morning now seemed to mock her as they opened to release her into the October afternoon. Standing outside Denver General Hospital, Sarah experienced the kind of disorientation that came from having fundamental assumptions about fairness and human decency suddenly proven wrong. She had served her country with honor, earned respect through competence and dedication, and committed herself to caring for others even when that commitment came at personal cost. Yet she had been treated as if her financial limitations made her unworthy of basic human dignity, as if her service and sacrifice meant nothing when measured against her ability to pay for an overpriced hospital meal. The city streets bustled, with normal activity, people going about their daily routines, oblivious to the small tragedy that had just unfolded within the hospital's walls. Sarah realized that her personal crisis was invisible to the broader world, just as the struggles of her patients were often invisible to the corporate executives who made decisions about their care from comfortable boardrooms far removed from the realities of human suffering. The parallel between her own treatment and the systematic devaluation of patient dignity was too obvious to ignore. The afternoon shift at Denver General proceeded without Sarah's presence for the first time in over 3 years, her absence creating ripples of confusion and concern among the medical staff who had come to depend on her steady competence during critical situations. Dr. Michael Chen, the chief resident in trauma surgery, noticed immediately when Sarah failed to return from her lunch break, particularly since a multi-vehicle accident had just brought 6 patients into the emergency department simultaneously. Chen had worked alongside Sarah during dozens of emergency situations and had learned to rely on her ability to anticipate his needs, manage complex patient care scenarios, and maintain calm efficiency when other staff members were overwhelmed. By the intensity of trauma medicine, the official explanation for Sarah's sudden departure came through administrative channels rather than direct communication, with Janet Morrison informing the medical staff that Sarah Martinez had been suspended, pending an investigation into conduct violations and policy infractions. The vague language typical of corporate disciplinary actions provided no specific details about the nature of the alleged violations, leaving Sarah's colleagues to speculate about what could have prompted such drastic action against someone universally regarded as one of the most competent and dedicated nurses on their team. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the attending physician who supervised the trauma wing, expressed immediate concern about the timing of Sarah's suspension during a period when staffing levels were already critically reduced due to budget cuts and position eliminations. Warren had been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years and had witnessed numerous administrative decisions that prioritized financial considerations over patient care, but the removal of an experienced trauma nurse during a staffing crisis represented a new level of institutional dysfunction that threatened patient safety in measurable ways. The medical staff's attempts to understand Sarah's suspension were complicated by Morrison's refusal to provide specific details about The incident that had triggered the disciplinary action. Hospital policy required confidentiality regarding personnel matters, but the lack of transparency created an atmosphere of uncertainty and suspicion that affected the entire department's morale. Nurses who had worked alongside Sarah for years found themselves questioning whether their own job security might be threatened by minor infractions or personality conflicts with supervisory staff. Maria Gonzalez from the cafeteria staff had witnessed the entire confrontation between Sarah and Morrison, and her account of the incident began circulating among hospital employees through informal networks that connected workers across different departments and shifts. According to Maria's version, Sarah had been publicly humiliated and forced to leave the cafeteria simply because she was a few dollars short for her lunch, a situation that many healthcare workers could easily imagine facing given the financial pressures created by stagnant wages and increasing living costs in Denver. The story of Sarah's treatment resonated powerfully among hospital employees who had experienced similar financial stress and had witnessed the gradual erosion of benefits and support that had once made healthcare careers economically viable for working-class professionals. Nurses, orderlies, food service workers, and maintenance staff began sharing their own stories of financial hardship, creating an informal catalogue of the human costs associated with Meridian Healthcare's profit maximization strategies. Kevin, the inexperienced cashier who had been working the register during Sarah's confrontation with Morrison, was deeply troubled by what he had witnessed and sought guidance from more experienced cafeteria staff about whether he could have handled the situation differently. His supervisor, Robert Kim, explained that company policy required exact payment for all purchases and that employees were not authorized to provide discounts or payment flexibility, except under very specific circumstances outlined in the employee handbook. Kim's explanation revealed the broader context of corporate policies that had transformed Denver General's cafeteria from a service provided to the hospital community into a profit center that operated according to strict business principles. Every transaction was monitored by corporate headquarters, with individual employees held accountable for any deviations from established pricing structures or payment requirements. The computerized system that tracked all purchases flagged unusual transactions for review by supervisory staff, creating an environment where employees had little discretion to address individual circumstances with compassion or flexibility. The elimination of employee meal subsidies had been particularly devastating for lower-paid hospital workers, many of whom depended on affordable cafeteria food during their shifts because they lacked time or resources to prepare meals at home. Nursing assistants, housekeeping staff, and security personnel found themselves choosing between adequate nutrition and other essential expenses, creating a situation where people responsible for patient care were themselves experiencing food insecurity within the institution where they worked. Sarah's suspension created operational challenges that extended far beyond the immediate impact on trauma department staffing levels. Her expertise in emergency medicine, developed through military training and refined through years of civilian practice, had made her an informal mentor for newer nurses who relied on her guidance during complex medical situations. Without her presence, the learning curve for inexperienced staff became steeper and more dangerous, particularly during high-stress scenarios where split-second decisions could determine patient outcomes. The afternoon brought a series of medical emergencies that would normally have been managed efficiently with Sarah's assistance, but instead created stress and confusion among the remaining nursing staff. A motorcycle accident victim required immediate surgical intervention, but the coordination between emergency department and operating room staff lacked the seamless efficiency that Sarah's experience typically provided. An elderly patient experiencing cardiac complications needed constant monitoring, But reduced staffing levels meant that other responsibilities had to be neglected to provide adequate care. Dr. Chen found himself spending additional time on nursing, coordination tasks that Sarah had previously handled independently, reducing his availability for direct patient care and surgical procedures. The ripple effects of her absence demonstrated how individual staff members could become integral to institutional functioning, particularly when budget cuts had eliminated redundancy and backup support systems. The hospital's efficiency had been built on the assumption that experienced professionals like Sarah would continue absorbing additional responsibilities without proportional compensation or recognition. Morrison's decision to suspend Sarah had been made unilaterally, without consultation with medical staff who depended on her expertise or consideration of the operational impact during an already challenging period. The administrative authority to remove nursing staff without input from physicians or department heads reflected the corporate structure that had been implemented since Meridian's acquisition, where business managers, rather than medical professionals, made decisions about clinical operations and patient care resources. The nursing staff's informal network began organizing a quiet investigation into the circumstances of Sarah's suspension, with several colleagues contacting her directly to express support and gather information about potential appeals or grievance procedures. These conversations revealed that Sarah had been struggling financially despite working full-time in a professional position, a situation that many of her colleagues found personally troubling and systemically problematic. Jennifer Walsh, a nurse practitioner who had worked with Sarah for 2 years, discovered that Sarah's financial difficulties stemmed partly from medical expenses related to her combat injury that were not fully covered by Veterans Affairs healthcare benefits. The complexity of navigating multiple healthcare systems while working within one had created bureaucratic obstacles and unexpected costs that significantly impacted Sarah's monthly budget, despite her dedication to helping others navigate similar challenges. The revelation that a combat veteran providing medical care was struggling to afford basic necessities while working at a profitable healthcare institution struck many staff members as fundamentally unjust and emblematic of broader systemic problems. Sarah's military service had included multiple deployments to Afghanistan, where she had provided emergency medical care under combat conditions that far exceeded anything encountered in civilian trauma centers. Her expertise had literally saved lives under circumstances where failure meant death for American soldiers, depending on her competence and courage. Walsh's research into Sarah's background revealed details about her military service that few civilian colleagues had known, including commendations for exceptional performance under fire and recognition for medical innovations that had improved survival rates for combat casualties. The Army had trained her in advanced trauma techniques that exceeded the qualifications of many civilian nurses. Yet the transition to civilian healthcare had required additional certification and training that Sarah had pursued at personal expense. While working full-time, the disconnect between Sarah's military service record and her treatment by hospital administration became a focal point for staff discussions about institutional values and priorities. Many healthcare workers had chosen their careers based on idealistic motivations about serving others and making meaningful contributions to human welfare. But the corporate environment increasingly emphasized financial metrics over mission-driven objectives. Evening shift nurses arriving for work learned about Sarah's suspension through the informal communication networks that connected hospital staff across different departments and time periods. The story spread rapidly among people who understood the financial pressures facing healthcare workers and who had witnessed the gradual deterioration of working conditions under Meridian's management. Each retelling of the incident added emotional weight and symbolic significance to what might otherwise have been dismissed as a minor administrative action. The trauma department's evening operations confirmed the operational impact of Sarah's absence, with patient care coordination requiring additional time and attention from staff members who were already stretched beyond optimal capacity. A construction accident brought multiple casualties requiring simultaneous treatment, and the lack of Sarah's organizational skills and clinical expertise created delays and inefficiencies that could have compromised patient outcomes under different circumstances. Dr. Warren documented these operational challenges in a formal report to hospital administration, arguing that the suspension of experienced nursing staff during a period of reduced staffing levels created unacceptable risks to patient safety and departmental efficiency. Her report included specific examples of how Sarah's absence had affected patient care coordination and recommended immediate reconsideration of the disciplinary action based on operational necessity rather than administrative policy. The formal report created a paper trail that would become important in subsequent developments, but the immediate response from administration was to defend Morrison's authority to make personnel decisions and to suggest that any operational difficulties were temporary adjustments that would resolve themselves as staff adapted to new circumstances. The dismissive response reflected the corporate mindset that viewed individual employees as replaceable resources rather than unique contributors to institutional mission and patient care quality. Sarah spent the evening in her small apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit in a neighborhood that had become increasingly gentrified as Denver's economy grew, and housing costs escalated beyond the reach of many working professionals. The apartment reflected her practical approach to living, with minimal furniture and decorations, but careful attention to cleanliness and organization that reflected her military training and professional discipline. The suspension had created immediate financial concerns that extended beyond the loss of daily wages to include potential long-term career consequences that could affect her ability to maintain professional licensure and find alternative employment. Nursing positions required background checks and references that could be compromised by disciplinary actions, particularly in a healthcare industry where corporate networks shared information about problem employees across multiple institutions. Sarah's phone buzzed with text messages throughout the evening as word of her suspension spread through Denver General's informal communication networks. Nurses from different shifts, doctors she had worked alongside, and even support staff from departments she rarely interacted with reached out to express their disbelief and support. The volume of messages surprised her, revealing how many colleagues had noticed her dedication and professionalism over the years, even when she had assumed her work went largely unrecognized within the hospital's increasingly impersonal corporate structure. Among the messages was one from Dr. Chen that particularly caught her attention. He had written simply, "This is wrong, and people need to know the truth about what happened." His message included a phone number for James Rodriguez, an investigative journalist with the Denver Post who specialized in healthcare industry reporting and had been following Meridian Healthcare's acquisition and management of local medical facilities. Chen suggested that Sarah's story might be part of a larger pattern of corporate behavior that deserved public scrutiny. The idea of speaking with a journalist felt simultaneously appealing and terrifying to Sarah. Her military training had instilled deep respect for operational security and chain of command, making her naturally reluctant to discuss internal institutional matters with outside parties. However, her growing awareness that her personal situation reflected broader systemic problems affecting healthcare workers and patients throughout Meridian's network created a sense of obligation that transcended her individual concerns about career consequences. Sarah's apartment felt smaller and more confining as the evening progressed, the familiar space transformed by uncertainty about her immediate future and growing anger about the injustice of her treatment. She found herself pacing between the kitchen and living room, her mind racing through possible scenarios and strategies while her body remained restless with unresolved energy. The transition from active military service to civilian life had required learning to channel her operational mindset into less dramatic but equally important challenges. Yet the current situation felt like a return to the kind of strategic thinking required during combat deployments. The financial implications of her suspension became more concrete as Sarah reviewed her monthly budget and calculated how long her savings would sustain her basic living expenses. Her Army disability compensation provided a foundation, but the majority of her income came from nursing wages that had now disappeared indefinitely. The timing was particularly problematic because she had recently paid for continuing education, requirements mandated by Colorado's Nursing Licensure Board, an investment in her professional development that now seemed potentially wasted if Meridian's disciplinary action prevented her from returning to hospital work. Her laptop contained files related to incidents she had observed and documented during her 3 years at Denver General, situations where corporate policies had conflicted with optimal patient care or where cost-cutting measures had created safety concerns. Sarah had maintained these records partly out of professional habit developed during military service, where detailed documentation was essential for operational analysis and improvement, but also because she had sensed that evidence might eventually be needed to support concerns about institutional priorities and patient welfare. The documentation revealed patterns that extended far beyond her individual experience, including multiple instances where experienced nurses had been disciplined or terminated for actions that prioritized patient care over administrative efficiency. Sarah had witnessed colleagues being written up for spending extra time with patients who needed emotional support, for advocating too aggressively for resources that patients required, or for questioning medical orders that seemed influenced more by financial considerations than clinical judgment. One particularly disturbing case involved Patricia Williams, a nurse with 12 years of experience who had been terminated 6 months earlier for allegedly violating corporate policies regarding pharmaceutical administration. According to official records, Williams had administered pain medication to a terminal cancer patient outside of prescribed schedules, but Sarah's contemporaneous notes revealed that Williams had been responding to a physician's verbal order that was later denied when questions arose about insurance coverage for additional medication doses. Williams' termination had been processed through human resources channels that emphasized policy violations while minimizing the clinical context and physician involvement that had actually driven her actions. The selective presentation of facts had made Williams appear reckless and insubordinate rather than compassionate and responsive to medical needs, demonstrating how corporate disciplinary procedures could be used to eliminate staff members who prioritized patient care over administrative compliance. Sarah's documentation also included examples of how Meridian's cost-cutting measures had affected patient outcomes in ways that might not be immediately apparent to regulatory authorities or insurance companies. Reduced nursing staff levels had led to delays in medication administration, increased infection rates due to inadequate sanitation protocols, and longer patient recovery times that translated into additional complications and extended hospital stays that ultimately cost more than the original savings from staff reductions. The electronic medical record system implemented by Meridian had been designed to improve efficiency and reduce costs, but Sarah had observed how the emphasis on data entry and documentation requirements often pulled nurses away from direct patient care at critical moments. The system required extensive justification for any actions that deviated from standard protocols, creating bureaucratic obstacles that discouraged individualized care and clinical judgment in favor of algorithmic approaches that might not address unique patient circumstances. These systemic issues had been documented in reports and complaints submitted through official channels. But Sarah had noticed that internal feedback mechanisms seemed designed to absorb criticism rather than address underlying problems. Committees were formed to study issues, policies were revised to address specific complaints, and administrators expressed concern about quality improvement. But the fundamental tension between profit maximization and patient care remained unresolved and largely unacknowledged. The evening's reflection convinced Sarah that her personal situation was indeed connected to broader institutional problems that affected countless healthcare workers and patients throughout Meridian's network of facilities. The company's business model appeared to depend on extracting maximum revenue from healthcare services while minimizing labor costs and operational expenses, creating inherent conflicts between financial success and medical mission that played out in individual cases, like her cafeteria incident. Sarah's military experience had taught her to think systematically about complex problems and to consider how individual actions could contribute to larger strategic objectives. Applying this analytical framework to her current situation, she began to see her potential response as an opportunity to expose institutional practices that harmed both healthcare workers and patients, while benefiting corporate shareholders and executive leadership who remained insulated from the human consequences of their decisions. The decision to contact James Rodriguez felt like crossing a threshold from private suffering to public advocacy, a transition that would require courage and commitment, but might also create opportunities for meaningful change. Sarah understood that speaking publicly about her experience would likely eliminate any possibility of returning to work at Denver General, but her growing awareness of systemic problems suggested that her individual career concerns were less important than the broader issues affecting healthcare delivery and worker dignity. Rodriguez answered his phone on the second ring, despite the late hour, and listened intently as Sarah explained her situation and the broader context of corporate practices she had observed. His questions revealed familiarity with Meridian Healthcare's business strategies and previous controversies involving their treatment of medical staff and patients. He had been investigating complaints about the company's operations for several months and viewed Sarah's story as potentially providing the human perspective that could make abstract policy criticisms more concrete and compelling for newspaper readers. The journalist's interest in her story was both encouraging and intimidating for Sarah, who realized that media attention would transform her personal grievance into a public case study that might attract scrutiny from corporate legal departments and public relations firms specializing in damage control. Rodriguez assured her that responsible journalism would protect her from retaliation, while ensuring that her allegations were thoroughly verified through independent sources and documentation. Their conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, with Rodriguez asking detailed questions about specific incidents, corporate policies, and institutional changes Sarah had observed since Meridian's acquisition of Denver General. His inquiries demonstrated sophisticated understanding of healthcare industry dynamics, and suggested that her individual story would be placed within a broader context of corporate behavior patterns that might interest state regulatory authorities and federal oversight agencies. The interview process helped Sarah clarify her own thinking about the significance of her experience and the potential impact of speaking publicly about issues that many healthcare workers experienced but rarely discussed outside their immediate professional circles. Rodriguez explained that investigative journalism could serve as a catalyst for institutional change by creating public awareness and political pressure that might otherwise be lacking when corporate practices remained hidden from general scrutiny. As their conversation concluded, Rodriguez requested permission to contact other Denver General employees who might be willing to speak anonymously about their experiences with Meridian's management practices and their impact on patient care and working conditions. Sarah agreed to provide contact information for colleagues who had expressed concerns about institutional changes, understanding that a comprehensive investigation would be more effective than individual complaints in creating pressure for meaningful reform. The phone call left Sarah feeling simultaneously energized and apprehensive about the path she had chosen to pursue. Speaking with Rodriguez had confirmed her suspicion that her personal situation reflected broader problems affecting healthcare workers throughout Meridian's network, but it had also committed her to a course of action that would likely have significant consequences for her career and personal life. Sleep proved elusive as Sarah's mind continued processing the day's events and their potential implications for her future. The suspension from Denver General had been humiliating and financially devastating, but it had also created an opportunity to address systemic problems that she had observed but felt powerless to change while working within the institutional hierarchy. Her military service had taught her that meaningful action sometimes required personal sacrifice, and her growing understanding of healthcare industry dynamics suggested that her individual experience might contribute to broader efforts to reform corporate practices that prioritized profit over human dignity. The next morning would bring unexpected developments that would transform her situation in ways she could never have anticipated. But the evening's reflection and decision to speak with Rodriguez had already begun a process that would ultimately reveal connections between her personal experience and much larger questions about corporate responsibility, healthcare access, and the treatment of American veterans by institutions that claim to honor their service while exploiting their dedication. Dawn broke gray and cold over Denver, with October frost coating the windows of Sarah's apartment as she prepared coffee and contemplated the uncertain day ahead. The suspension had disrupted her carefully structured routine, leaving her without the familiar rhythms of hospital shifts that had organized her life for the past 3 years. The silence of her apartment felt oppressive after years of constant activity in the trauma ward, where every moment had been filled with urgent purpose and clear objectives that matched her military training and professional identity. Her phone rang at 7:30. Displaying a number she didn't recognize with a local Denver area code. Sarah hesitated before answering, uncertain whether hospital administration might be calling with updates about her disciplinary status or whether other consequences from yesterday's events might be emerging. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Foster, identifying herself as a senior nurse practitioner at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, another major medical facility in Denver's healthcare network. Foster explained that she had heard about Sarah's situation through informal networks that connected healthcare professionals across different institutions, and she was calling to discuss potential employment opportunities that might be available for an experienced trauma nurse with Sarah's qualifications and reputation. The conversation revealed that Sarah's professional competence was well known beyond Denver General, with her military background and clinical skills creating a positive reputation that transcended institutional boundaries. The job inquiry surprised Sarah, who had assumed that Meridian's disciplinary action would complicate her ability to find alternative employment in Denver's healthcare market. Foster's call suggested that other medical institutions viewed her suspension as reflecting poorly on Denver General's management rather than on Sarah's professional capabilities, creating unexpected opportunities for career advancement despite The immediate crisis created by her confrontation with Morrison. Presbyterian St. Joseph operated under different corporate ownership than Meridian Healthcare, with management practices that Foster described as more supportive of nursing staff and more focused on patient care quality rather than exclusively financial metrics. The facility had been actively recruiting experienced nurses from Meridian facilities, recognizing that corporate cost-cutting measures were creating opportunities to attract talented professionals who were dissatisfied with working conditions at competitor institutions. Foster's description of Presbyterian St. Joseph's approach to nursing management revealed significant differences from Sarah's recent experience at Denver General, including competitive salaries, comprehensive benefits packages, and institutional support for continuing education and professional development. The contrast highlighted how Meridian's business model had created working conditions that were increasingly uncompetitive compared to other healthcare employers who recognized the importance of retaining experienced medical staff. The conversation with Foster lasted over an hour, covering Sarah's background, her experience with trauma nursing, and her career objectives beyond her immediate need to find alternative employment. Foster seemed genuinely interested in Sarah's military experience and how those skills translated into civilian healthcare, suggesting that Presbyterian St. Joseph valued the kind of leadership and crisis management abilities that military service had developed. As their conversation progressed, Foster revealed that Presbyterian St. Joseph had been investigating reports about working conditions and patient care quality at Meridian facilities as part of their competitive analysis and recruitment strategy. The hospital's administration was aware of staff turnover rates at Denver General and other Meridian facilities that suggested systemic problems with employee satisfaction and retention that created opportunities for competitor institutions to attract experienced professionals. Foster's insights into Denver's healthcare job market provided Sarah with a broader perspective on her professional options and the potential value of her experience to institutions that prioritized clinical excellence over cost minimization. The conversation left her feeling more optimistic about her immediate career prospects while reinforcing her decision to speak publicly about the systemic problems she had observed at Denver General. After concluding the call with Foster, Sarah received a text message from James Rodriguez requesting a meeting to discuss her story in more detail and to review documentation she had mentioned during their previous evening's conversation. The journalist had spent the morning making preliminary inquiries about Meridian Healthcare's practices and had discovered additional sources who might be willing to discuss their experiences with the company's management approach. Rodriguez suggested meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Denver that would provide privacy for their conversation while allowing Sarah to maintain some distance from the hospital environment where she might encounter colleagues or administrators. The location choice reflected the journalist's understanding that healthcare workers who spoke critically about their employers often faced retaliation and required discretion to protect their professional relationships and career prospects. Sarah agreed to meet Rodriguez at noon, giving her time to organize the documentation she had maintained regarding incidents at Denver General and to prepare for what would likely be a comprehensive interview about her observations and experiences. The prospect of discussing institutional problems with a journalist felt both empowering and risky, representing a significant departure from the chain of command culture that had shaped her professional approach since military service. The morning hours provided an opportunity for Sarah to review her files and organize evidence that might support broader criticisms of Meridian's practices beyond her individual experience. Her documentation included incident reports, email communications, policy changes, and observational notes that painted a picture of systematic prioritization of financial considerations over patient care and employee welfare. One particularly compelling piece of evidence was a series of emails between nursing supervisors discussing strategies for reducing labor costs through schedule manipulation and workload redistribution that increased patient-to-nurse ratios beyond levels recommended by professional nursing organizations. The communications revealed awareness among management that these changes could compromise patient safety, but emphasized that corporate pressure for cost reduction made such measures necessary for maintaining profitability targets. Another significant document was a memorandum from Meridian's corporate headquarters outlining performance metrics for individual facilities that emphasized revenue generation and expense control, while providing minimal guidance about clinical quality indicators or patient satisfaction measures. The memo suggested that hospital administrators were evaluated primarily on financial performance rather than medical outcomes, creating institutional incentives that inherently conflicted with healthcare mission and professional ethics. Sarah's review of her documentation revealed patterns of corporate behavior that extended far beyond individual incidents or personality conflicts to encompass systematic business practices that treated healthcare as a profit-maximizing industry rather than a service dedicated to human welfare. The evidence suggested that her cafeteria confrontation was symptomatic of broader institutional values that viewed employees and patients primarily as sources of revenue rather than human beings deserving dignity and compassion. The coffee shop meeting with Rodriguez took place in a busy downtown location where their conversation could blend into the ambient noise of business discussions and casual interactions. The journalist arrived with a digital recorder and notebook, prepared to conduct a formal interview that would provide foundation for investigative reporting about Meridian Healthcare's business practices and their impact on healthcare workers and patients. Rodriguez had spent the morning researching Meridian's corporate structure, financial performance, and regulatory compliance record, discovering patterns that suggested Sarah's experience was representative of problems affecting the company's operations nationwide. His preliminary investigation had revealed complaints filed with state health departments in multiple states regarding staffing levels, patient care quality, and employee treatment at Meridian facilities. The interview process was more thorough and systematic than Sarah had anticipated, with Rodriguez asking detailed questions about specific incidents, requesting clarification about corporate policies and their implementation, and seeking her analysis of how management decisions affected patient care and working conditions. His questions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of healthcare industry dynamics and suggested that her story would be placed within a comprehensive investigation of corporate practices. Rodriguez was particularly interested in the documentation Sarah had maintained, recognizing that internal communications and policy documents could provide objective evidence to support criticisms that might otherwise be dismissed as disgruntled employee complaints. The journalist explained that investigative reporting required multiple sources and verifiable evidence to establish credibility and protect against legal challenges from corporate legal departments. During their conversation, Rodriguez revealed that he had been contacted by other healthcare workers from Meridian facilities who had experienced similar treatment or had observed practices that prioritized financial considerations over patient care. The emerging pattern suggested that Sarah's experience was part of a systematic approach to healthcare management that affected employees and patients throughout the company's network of facilities. The journalist's investigation had also uncovered financial information about Meridian Healthcare that provided context for understanding the corporate pressure that drove cost-cutting measures and employee discipline policies. The company's ownership structure included private equity investors who expected substantial returns on their healthcare investments, creating financial obligations that required constant revenue growth and expense reduction to meet investor expectations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Rodriguez explained that private equity ownership of healthcare facilities had become increasingly common throughout the United States, with investment firms purchasing hospitals and medical practices as financial assets rather than community services. This ownership model created inherent tensions between profit maximization and healthcare mission that played out in individual cases like Sarah's suspension, but reflected broader changes in how American healthcare was organized and delivered. The interview revealed that Sarah's military background and dedication to service made her story particularly compelling as an example of how corporate healthcare practices affected American veterans who had transitioned to civilian careers in medical fields. Rodriguez believed that the contrast between her military service and her treatment by a healthcare corporation would resonate with readers who were concerned about veteran welfare and healthcare access. As their conversation continued, Rodriguez received a phone call that he described as urgent, stepping away from their table to speak privately with someone who had additional information relevant to his investigation. When he returned, his expression had changed to one of intense interest and excitement, suggesting that new developments had emerged that would significantly expand the scope of his reporting. Rodriguez explained that he had just spoken with someone who claimed to have detailed knowledge about Meridian Healthcare's corporate practices and their connection to financial arrangements that might involve Sarah's situation in ways she had never suspected. The caller had requested anonymity, but had provided specific information that Rodriguez needed to verify through independent sources before he could discuss the details with Sarah. The mysterious phone call added an element of intrigue to Sarah's story that she hadn't anticipated, suggesting that her individual experience might be connected to larger financial or corporate arrangements that extended beyond hospital operations into broader business relationships. Rodriguez's reaction indicated that the information was potentially significant enough to transform his investigation from a local story about healthcare worker treatment into a more comprehensive examination of corporate practices with wider implications. The journalist requested permission to contact Sarah again once he had verified the new information and had a clearer understanding of its relevance to her situation. He emphasized that investigative reporting required careful verification of all claims and sources to ensure accuracy and protect against legal challenges, but he was clearly energized by the potential for discovering connections that might reveal systematic problems requiring public attention and regulatory oversight. Sarah left the coffee shop meeting feeling that her decision to speak with Rodriguez had been validated by his professional approach and his apparent discovery of broader issues that supported her concerns about institutional practices. The journalist's investigation suggested that her individual story was part of a larger pattern that might ultimately lead to meaningful reform of corporate healthcare practices that prioritized profit over human dignity and medical mission. Afternoon following Sarah's meeting with Rodriguez brought an unexpected sequence of events that would transform her understanding of the forces at work behind her suspension and the broader implications of her situation. At precisely 2:15, as she was organizing financial documents to assess her options for surviving an extended period without employment, her apartment buzzer rang with the distinctive pattern that indicated someone was requesting entry to the building. Sarah approached the intercom with caution, still adjusting to the unfamiliar routine of being home during weekday afternoons when most people were at work. The voice that responded to her inquiry was professional and unfamiliar, identifying the speaker as David Chen, an attorney representing what he described as interested parties who wished to discuss her recent experience at Denver General Hospital. The formal language and unexpected timing created immediate suspicion, as Sarah's military training had taught her to be wary of unsolicited contact from people claiming legal authority. Chen's presence in her neighborhood seemed improbable given that she had not contacted any attorneys or initiated legal proceedings related to her suspension. His explanation that he represented parties with legitimate interest in her situation raised more questions than it answered, particularly since he declined to specify exactly who had hired him or how they had learned about her circumstances. The conversation through the intercom felt like an interrogation, where she was expected to provide information without receiving adequate explanation of his purpose or authority. Against her better judgment, Sarah agreed to meet Chen in the building's lobby rather than allowing him access to her apartment, maintaining the kind of security awareness that military service had ingrained as second nature. The attorney appeared to be in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed in the kind of expensive suit that suggested corporate legal practice rather than the public service or criminal defense work that might normally involve hospital employee disputes. Chen's introduction revealed that he represented a consortium of business interests that had been monitoring Meridian Healthcare's operations as part of ongoing competitive analysis and investment considerations. His clients had become aware of her situation through sources he declined to identify, and they believed her experience might provide valuable information about corporate practices that could affect their business relationships and strategic planning. The attorney's explanation felt deliberately vague, providing enough information to establish legitimacy while withholding specific details that might help Sarah understand exactly who wanted to speak with her and why her individual case had attracted attention from business interests with sufficient resources to hire expensive legal representation. Chen's approach suggested that powerful people were involved in situations she didn't fully understand, creating both opportunities and risks that she was not yet equipped to evaluate. Chen offered to retain Sarah as a consultant for his clients, providing immediate financial compensation in exchange for her cooperation with their investigation into Meridian Healthcare's business practices and their impact on healthcare workers and patient care quality. The proposal included a retainer fee that would exceed her monthly nursing salary, along with ongoing payments for providing detailed information about her observations and experiences at Denver General. The financial offer was both attractive and suspicious, providing a solution to her immediate economic concerns while creating new questions about the motivations and identity of Chen's clients. Sarah's military experience had taught her to be cautious about offers that seemed too generous, particularly when they came from sources that declined to provide complete information about their objectives and methods. Chen pressed for an immediate decision, explaining that his client's interest in her situation was time-sensitive and that delays might eliminate the opportunity for mutually beneficial cooperation. The pressure tactics felt familiar from military contexts, where intelligence operatives used urgency to prevent careful consideration of proposals that might not serve the target's best interests, reinforcing Sarah's instinct to maintain skepticism about the attorney's true agenda. Sarah requested time to consider the proposal and to consult with her own legal counsel before making any commitments to Chen's clients. The attorney provided his business card and emphasized that his offer would remain available for only 48 hours, after which his clients would pursue alternative approaches to gathering the information they required for their business. Purposes. The encounter with Chen left Sarah feeling that her suspension from Denver General had attracted attention from forces she hadn't anticipated and didn't understand. The possibility that her individual case was connected to larger business relationships and financial arrangements created new dimensions of complexity that extended far beyond her immediate concerns about employment and financial stability. Later, that afternoon, Rodriguez called with updates on his investigation that provided additional context for understanding Chen's unexpected appearance. The journalist had verified information from his mysterious source and had discovered connections between Meridian Healthcare and other business entities that suggested Sarah's situation might be more significant than either of them had initially understood. Rodriguez explained that Meridian Healthcare was in the process of negotiating a major acquisition that would expand their network of medical facilities throughout the western United States. But the deal required regulatory approval and due diligence investigations that could be affected by negative publicity about the company's management practices and employee treatment. Sarah's story, if published at a critical moment in the acquisition timeline, might create complications for Meridian's business plans. The journalist's investigation had also revealed that Meridian's corporate structure included relationships with investment firms and financial institutions that specialized in healthcare industry acquisitions, creating complex webs of business relationships where individual hospitals served as assets in larger financial portfolios rather than independent community institutions focused on patient care. Rodriguez had discovered that several other Meridian facilities had experienced similar incidents involving the disciplinary treatment of experienced healthcare workers who had raised concerns about patient care quality or had found themselves in financial difficulties that conflicted with corporate image management. The pattern suggested systematic approaches to employee relations that prioritized corporate reputation and operational efficiency over individual dignity and professional support. The timing of Sarah's suspension, according to Rodriguez's source, might have been influenced by Meridian's desire to eliminate potential critics or whistleblowers during the sensitive period when acquisition negotiations required demonstrating stable operations and positive employee relations to potential business and partners and regulatory authorities. Her military background and clinical competence made her a credible voice who could damage corporate reputation if she chose to speak publicly about institutional problems. Rodriguez's investigation had also uncovered financial information about the acquisition deal that helped explain why powerful business interests might be monitoring Meridian's operations and seeking information about potential problems that could affect the transaction's success. The deal involved hundreds of millions of dollars and multiple investment firms whose financial returns depended on Meridian's continued profitability and market expansion. The journalist warned Sarah that her situation had likely attracted attention from multiple parties with competing interests, including Meridian's corporate legal department, investment firms involved in the acquisition, and potentially regulatory authorities who might be conducting their own investigations into healthcare industry practices. Each group had different motivations for either supporting or suppressing public discussion of her experience. Rodriguez advised Sarah to be extremely cautious about any legal or financial offers related to her situation, explaining that corporate legal strategies often involved identifying potential critics and neutralizing their ability to speak publicly through confidentiality agreements, financial settlements, or other arrangements that served corporate interests rather than individual welfare or public accountability. The journalist's warnings about corporate legal tactics resonated with Sarah's military training in operational security and threat assessment, confirming her instinctive caution about Chen's offer and his client's undisclosed agenda. Rodriguez suggested that Sarah might benefit from consulting with attorneys who specialized in whistleblower protection and employment law, rather than accepting representation from lawyers whose primary loyalty was to corporate interests. As evening approached, Sarah received another unexpected contact, this time from Dr. Warren, the attending physician who had submitted a formal report about operational problems created by her suspension. Warren explained that hospital administration had responded to her report by scheduling a meeting to discuss staffing concerns and patient safety issues, but the meeting had been postponed indefinitely without explanation. Warren's call revealed that other medical staff at Denver General were experiencing pressure to minimize discussion of Sarah's case and to avoid public statements that might be construed as criticism of administrative decisions or corporate policies. Several physicians had been advised by hospital legal counsel to refrain from speaking with media representatives or external investigators about internal operations and personnel matters. The systematic effort to control information and limit discussion of Sarah's case suggested that Meridian's corporate response involved more than routine personnel management and extended into broader strategies for protecting corporate reputation during the critical acquisition negotiations. Warren's description of administrative pressure on medical staff indicated that Sarah's individual situation had become a corporate crisis, requiring coordinated response from legal, public relations, and executive leadership. Warren also revealed that she had been contacted by investigators representing regulatory authorities who were conducting routine compliance reviews of Meridian facilities as part of the acquisition approval process. The investigators had expressed interest in speaking with healthcare workers who had observed corporate practices that might affect patient care quality or compliance with federal healthcare regulations. The physician's information about regulatory investigations provided Sarah with additional context for understanding why her story had attracted attention from multiple parties and why Chen's clients might be interested in her experiences at Denver General. Federal healthcare regulations required hospitals to maintain certain staffing levels and patient care standards, creating legal vulnerabilities for companies whose cost-cutting measures might compromise compliance with regulatory requirements. Warren suggested that Sarah's documentation of incidents and observations at Denver General might be valuable evidence for regulatory investigators who were evaluating Meridian's fitness to operate additional healthcare facilities under federal oversight. The physician emphasized that cooperation with legitimate regulatory authorities could serve public interest, while providing Sarah with legal protection against corporate retaliation. The conversation with Warren convinced Sarah that her individual case had indeed become connected to much larger issues involving healthcare regulation, corporate accountability, and the treatment of American veterans by institutions that claimed to support military families while prioritizing profit maximization over service mission. As the day concluded, Sarah realized that her decision to speak with Rodriguez about her experience had initiated a series of events that were revealing the complex relationships between healthcare corporations, investment firms, regulatory authorities, and individual workers who found themselves caught between competing interests and powerful forces they hadn't anticipated. The evening brought one final, unexpected development when Sarah's phone rang, with a call from an unlisted number that displayed no caller identification. The voice belonged to someone who identified himself only as a representative of parties interested in ensuring that her story received appropriate attention and that her rights were protected during what he described as a developing situation, with significant implications for healthcare policy and corporate accountability. The mysterious caller provided no specific information about his identity or organization, but he offered resources and support that suggested access to substantial financial and legal capabilities. His knowledge of her situation was detailed and current, indicating that multiple parties were monitoring developments related to her case and the broader investigation into Meridian Healthcare's practices. The caller's offer of support came without explicit conditions or requirements, but his emphasis on the importance of her story for broader accountability efforts suggested that her cooperation with ongoing investigations might serve interests larger than her individual concerns about employment and financial stability. Morning arrived with an autumn storm that rattled the windows of Sarah's apartment and sent sheets of rain across Denver's downtown district, creating an atmospheric backdrop that matched the turbulence she felt about the forces gathering around her. Situation. She had spent a restless night considering the various offers, warnings, and mysterious contacts that had transformed her simple employment dispute into something resembling a complex intelligence operation with stakes she was only beginning to understand. The decision to contact Rodriguez again came as Sarah realized that the journalist's investigation might be her best protection against the competing interests that seemed determined to control or exploit her story for purposes that remained unclear. His professional commitment to uncovering truth provided a counterbalance to the corporate legal strategies and mysterious business interests that were offering financial incentives in exchange for her silence or cooperation with undisclosed agendas. Rodriguez answered her call immediately, and his tone suggested that overnight developments had further elevated the significance of her case within his broader investigation of Meridian Healthcare's practices. The journalist explained that his editors had approved expanded resources for investigating the company's business relationships and regulatory compliance record, indicating that Sarah's story had provided the human interest angle needed to justify comprehensive coverage of corporate healthcare practices. The morning's conversation with Rodriguez revealed that his investigation had uncovered specific connections between Meridian Healthcare and a private equity firm called Sentinel Capital Partners, whose investment strategy focused on acquiring healthcare facilities and implementing cost-cutting measures designed to maximize returns for institutional investors. Sentinel's business model depended on rapid operational changes that often resulted in reduced staffing, eliminated services, and increased prices for patients and families. Rodriguez had discovered that Sentinel's acquisition of healthcare facilities typically followed predictable patterns that included aggressive cost reduction, elimination of experienced staff who commanded higher salaries, and implementation of corporate policies that prioritized financial metrics over clinical outcomes. Sarah's experience at Denver General appeared to fit within this established pattern, suggesting that her suspension was part of systematic changes rather than an isolated incident involving personality conflicts or individual misconduct. The journalist's research into Sentinel Capital Partners had revealed a portfolio of healthcare investments across multiple states, with regulatory filings that documented consistent patterns of staff reductions, service eliminations, and patient care modifications that generated investor returns while creating operational challenges for medical professionals and accessibility problems for patients. The firm's approach to healthcare investment treated medical facilities as financial assets rather than community services, creating inherent conflicts between profit maximization and healthcare mission. Rodriguez explained that his investigation had attracted attention from federal regulatory authorities, who were conducting their own review of private equity involvement in healthcare delivery and its impact on patient access and care quality. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Health and Human Services had initiated coordinated investigations into whether private equity ownership of healthcare facilities created systemic risks to public health and violated federal regulations governing medical care delivery. The journalist sources within regulatory agencies had indicated that Sarah's case provided exactly the kind of individual example needed to illustrate how corporate financial strategies affected real people and compromised the healthcare system's ability to serve public needs. Her military background and dedication to service created a compelling narrative that contrasted sharply with corporate priorities that seemed to devalue both employee welfare and patient care. Rodriguez warned Sarah that her story would likely attract increasing attention from multiple parties as his investigation progressed and as regulatory authorities began examining Meridian's practices more closely. Corporate legal departments would attempt to discredit her testimony, while advocacy organizations and political figures might seek to use her experience to support broader healthcare reform initiatives that could benefit from her credible voice and military service record. The conversation with Rodriguez was interrupted by another call to Sarah's phone, this time displaying the number for Denver General Hospital's main switchboard. Sarah hesitated before answering, uncertain whether hospital administration was attempting to contact her about her suspension status or whether other developments had created new complications for her relationship with the institution where she had worked for 3 years. The caller identified herself as Linda Peterson from Denver General's Human Resources Department, explaining that hospital administration wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss Sarah's employment status and potential resolution of the issues that had led to her suspension. Peterson's tone was professionally neutral, providing no indication of whether the proposed meeting would result in reinstatement, termination, or some alternative arrangement that might address the concerns raised by her confrontation with Morrison. Peterson emphasized that the meeting was voluntary and that Sarah was welcome to bring legal representation if she felt it would be helpful for protecting her interests during discussions with hospital administration. The invitation to include legal counsel suggested that hospital management recognized the potential for legal complications arising from her suspension and wanted to ensure that any agreements or resolutions would be legally defensible. Sarah requested additional information about the meeting's agenda and the authority of participants to make decisions about her employment status. But Peterson explained that such details would be discussed during the meeting itself, rather than through preliminary conversations. The lack of specificity felt deliberately vague, creating uncertainty about whether the meeting represented a genuine attempt to resolve her situation or a corporate strategy for managing potential legal or public relations problems. The timing of the hospital's contact seemed significant, given the recent attention her case had received from journalists, attorneys, and mysterious business interests. Sarah suspected that Meridian's corporate legal department had become aware of external investigations and was attempting to control potential damage through direct negotiations with her before media coverage or regulatory scrutiny could create additional complications. Sarah agreed to attend the meeting, but insisted on scheduling it for the following week, providing time to consult with legal counsel and to better understand the broader context of investigations and business interests surrounding her case. Peterson accepted the delayed timeline and provided information about meeting logistics and administrative procedures for accessing the hospital during her suspension period. After concluding the call with Peterson, Sarah immediately contacted Rodriguez to inform him about the hospital's request for a meeting and to seek his advice about how to approach negotiations with Meridian's representatives. The journalist viewed the invitation as confirmation that corporate management was concerned about potential negative consequences from her case and was attempting to resolve the situation before it could attract additional public attention or regulatory scrutiny. Rodriguez suggested that Sarah's bargaining position had been significantly strengthened by the external attention her case had received, and by the broader investigation into Meridian's practices that was generating interest from regulatory authorities and investment industry observers. The hospital's invitation to negotiate represented recognition that her story could create substantial problems for the company if it remained unresolved during the critical period of acquisition negotiations and regulatory reviews. The journalist recommended that Sarah consult with employment attorneys who specialized in healthcare industry disputes and whistleblower protection cases, explaining that corporate settlement negotiations often involved complex legal arrangements designed to protect company interests while providing minimal benefits to individual employees. Professional legal representation would help ensure that any agreement served her long-term interests, rather than simply resolving Meridian's immediate concerns about negative publicity. Rodriguez also revealed that his investigation had uncovered additional evidence of systematic problems at Meridian facilities that supported Sarah's observations about corporate priorities and their impact on patient care and employee welfare. Internal documents obtained through confidential sources indicated that company executives were aware of operational problems created by cost-cutting measures, but had decided that potential legal and regulatory risks were acceptable given the financial benefits of reduced labor costs and operational expenses. The evidence discovered by Rodriguez included email communications between Meridian executives discussing strategies for managing negative publicity and regulatory inquiries related to staffing reductions and patient care incidents at facilities throughout their network. The communications revealed corporate awareness that their business practices created legal vulnerabilities and public relations risks that required ongoing management through legal, media, and political strategies. One particularly damaging document was a memorandum from Meridian's corporate counsel outlining legal strategies for defending against employee complaints and regulatory investigations, including recommendations for identifying and neutralizing potential whistleblowers before they could attract media attention or regulatory interest. Sarah's case appeared to fit within the systematic approach described in the memorandum, suggesting that her suspension was part of established corporate procedures rather than an isolated administrative decision. Rodriguez's investigation had also revealed financial information about Sentinel Capital Partners' investment expectations and timeline for achieving returns from their healthcare portfolio, including specific targets for cost reduction and revenue enhancement that required ongoing operational changes at facilities like Denver General. The investment firm's business plan depended on maintaining operational control while minimizing public scrutiny of their impact on healthcare delivery and community services. The journalist explained that his investigation was approaching publication readiness, with sufficient documentation and source verification to support comprehensive coverage of Meridian's business practices and their impact on healthcare workers and patients. Sarah's story would serve as the central narrative that illustrated broader systemic problems, but the article would include extensive evidence from internal documents, regulatory filings, and additional sources that confirmed patterns of corporate behavior affecting multiple facilities and thousands of employees. Rodriguez's timeline for publication coincided with critical moments in Meridian's acquisition negotiations and regulatory review processes, creating potential for maximum impact on corporate decision-making and public awareness of private equity involvement in healthcare delivery. The journalist believed that media coverage of Sarah's case could catalyze broader discussions about healthcare policy and corporate accountability that might influence regulatory decisions and political responses to private equity ownership of medical facilities. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah received another unexpected visitor in the form of Dr. Chen, who arrived at her apartment building without prior appointment and requested a brief conversation about developments related to her case. The physician appeared agitated and concerned, explaining that he had information about hospital administration's response to external inquiries that Sarah needed to understand before attending the scheduled meeting with Human Resources. Dr. Chen revealed that hospital management had been conducting internal investigations to identify staff members who might have provided information to external investigators or journalists, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and intimidation that was affecting medical operations and patient care coordination. Several nurses and physicians had been questioned about their communications with outside parties, and some had been warned about potential disciplinary consequences for discussing internal matters with unauthorized individuals. The physician's information confirmed Sarah's suspicions that Meridian's response to her case involved comprehensive damage control strategies that extended far beyond her individual employment situation. The corporate effort to identify and silence potential critics suggested systematic approaches to managing negative publicity and regulatory scrutiny that might compromise the acquisition negotiations and investment returns that drove company decision-making. Dr. Chen also warned Sarah that hospital legal counsel had been researching her background and personal circumstances, apparently seeking information that might be used to discredit her credibility or to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited during settlement negotiations. The physician emphasized that corporate legal strategies often involved personal attacks on critics and whistleblowers designed to divert attention from institutional problems by focusing on individual character and motivation. The warning about corporate research into her background reminded Sarah of intelligence operations she had observed during military service, where opposition forces attempted to gather personal information about key personnel for use in psychological warfare and strategic manipulation. The parallel between corporate legal tactics and military intelligence operations reinforced her understanding that powerful business interests would use sophisticated methods to protect their financial investments and market positions. Dr. Chen's visit concluded with his recommendation that Sarah document all contacts and communications related to her case, maintaining detailed records that could protect her against false allegations or misrepresentation of her actions and motivations. The physician also provided contact information for advocacy organizations that specialized in protecting healthcare workers who raised concerns about patient safety and corporate practices that compromised medical care quality. The morning of what would become the most transformative day in Sarah's life began with an unusual silence that seemed to settle over her apartment like a heavy blanket. The storm from the previous day had passed, leaving behind crystal-clear October air that made the Rocky Mountains visible from her kitchen window in sharp detail. She had spent the early hours reviewing legal documents that Rodriguez had helped her obtain, preparing for the afternoon meeting with Denver General's administration while trying to understand the broader implications of the corporate investigation that had engulfed her personal situation. At precisely 9 o'clock, Sarah's quiet morning was shattered by the distinctive sound of multiple luxury vehicles arriving on her normally quiet residential street. The rumble of powerful engines was followed by the precise choreography of car doors closing in sequence, creating a symphony of mechanical precision that suggested official business rather than casual neighborhood activity. Sarah moved to her window and observed 3 identical black Rolls-Royce vehicles parked in front of her building, their chrome fixtures gleaming in the morning sunlight like modern armor. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The sight of the luxury vehicles created immediate tension between curiosity and caution, as Sarah's military training kicked in with threat assessment protocols that had become second nature during her service in Afghanistan. The coordinated arrival of multiple expensive vehicles suggested either extreme wealth or official authority, both of which could represent either opportunity or danger, depending on the intentions of the occupants and their relationship to the complex situation surrounding her suspension and the ongoing investigations. A tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit emerged from the lead vehicle and approached her building with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command and immediate attention. His appearance suggested executive authority, with silver hair and bearing that conveyed both wealth and power, yet his approach to her building seemed respectful rather than aggressive, indicating that whatever business had brought him to her apartment was likely to involve negotiation rather than confrontation. Sarah's intercom buzzed with a polite but firm request from someone identifying himself as Thomas Meridian, who explained that he was the founder and chairman of Meridian Healthcare Systems, and that he needed to speak with her about matters of mutual importance that could not be adequately addressed through intermediaries or corporate representatives. The name struck Sarah like a physical blow, as she realized that the most powerful person in the company that had humiliated and suspended her was standing at her door requesting a personal meeting. The irony of Thomas Meridian personally visiting the apartment of a suspended nurse was not lost on Sarah, who understood that billionaire executives did not typically make house calls to address individual employee grievances unless extraordinary circumstances required their direct intervention. His presence suggested that her case had reached the highest levels of corporate attention and that the ongoing investigations and media coverage had created sufficient concern to warrant personal involvement from the company's founder. Sarah agreed to meet Meridian in her building's lobby, maintaining the same security protocols she had established for previous unexpected visitors, while recognizing that this encounter would likely be more significant than her previous interactions with attorneys and mysterious representatives. She descended to the lobby with a mixture of anticipation and wariness, uncertain about what the most powerful person in American healthcare could possibly want to discuss with a trauma nurse who had been suspended for being unable to afford a cafeteria meal. Thomas Meridian's appearance in person conveyed even more authority and presence than Sarah had anticipated, with the kind of physical bearing and intellectual intensity that suggested someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of people and billions of dollars. His greeting was respectful and professional, acknowledging her military service before introducing himself and explaining that he had come to discuss her situation personally because he believed that corporate intermediaries had failed to address the fundamental issues underlying her experience at Denver General. Meridian's explanation for his personal involvement revealed that he had been monitoring the situation surrounding her suspension and had become increasingly concerned about the disconnect between his company's stated values and the actual treatment of employees who embodied those values through their service and dedication. He explained that Sarah's military background and commitment to patient care represented exactly the kind of professional he wanted working in Meridian facilities, making her suspension a corporate failure that required his direct attention and correction. The billionaire's acknowledgement that her suspension represented a corporate failure was both validating and surprising to Sarah, who had expected that any contact from Meridian leadership would involve damage control or legal maneuvering rather than admission of institutional responsibility. His willingness to characterize her treatment as a failure suggested either genuine concern about corporate practices or sophisticated public relations strategy designed to minimize negative consequences from ongoing investigations and media coverage. Meridian requested permission to discuss her situation in detail, explaining that he had reviewed all available information about her case and had concluded that her experience reflected systematic problems within his organization that required fundamental changes rather than superficial policy adjustments. His description of systematic problems aligned with Sarah's own observations and the evidence that Rodriguez had uncovered, suggesting that corporate leadership was beginning to acknowledge issues that frontline employees had been experiencing for months or years. The conversation moved to a private seating area in the lobby, where Meridian could speak more freely about his company's operations and his personal involvement in addressing the problems that had led to Sarah's suspension. His explanation revealed that he had been conducting his own investigation into Meridian Healthcare's operations, following reports of employee dissatisfaction and patient care concerns that suggested his corporate structure was not functioning according to his original vision and values. Meridian's investigation had revealed that private equity investors, including Sentinel Capital Partners, had gained significant influence over operational decisions at individual facilities through complex financial arrangements that prioritized cost reduction and profit maximization over the patient care mission that had originally motivated his entry into the healthcare industry. His description of investor influence confirmed Rodriguez's reporting about private equity involvement in healthcare decision-making and its impact on medical professionals and patients. The billionaire explained that his personal wealth and business success had originated from his commitment to providing high-quality healthcare services that served community needs while generating reasonable returns for investors, but that the involvement of private equity firms had gradually transformed his company's culture and operational priorities in ways that conflicted with his fundamental values and long-term vision for American healthcare delivery. Meridian's acknowledgement of private equity influence over his company's operations provided Sarah with context for understanding how her individual experience related to broader changes in healthcare delivery that affected millions of Americans who depended on corporate medical facilities for their care. His description of cultural transformation within his organization confirmed that her observations about institutional priorities were accurate and reflected systematic changes rather than isolated incidents or personality conflicts. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Meridian revealed that his personal investigation into company operations had uncovered evidence of financial irregularities and potential legal violations involving the private equity firms that had invested in Meridian Healthcare. His discovery of these problems had prompted him to initiate legal action to regain operational control of his company and to eliminate the investor influence that had compromised his original mission and values. Meridian explained that his legal battle with private equity investors required evidence of how their operational demands had affected employee welfare and patient care, making Sarah's case a crucial element in demonstrating the human costs of financial strategies that prioritized investor returns over healthcare mission. Her documentation of incidents and observations at Denver General provided exactly the kind of evidence needed to support his legal arguments about investor interference with medical operations. The billionaire's request for Sarah's cooperation in his legal battle against private equity investors created an unexpected alliance between a suspended nurse and one of America's wealthiest healthcare executives, united by shared concerns about corporate practices that compromised patient care and employee dignity. His offer to reinstate her with full back pay and benefits was accompanied by a broader proposal to make her a key witness in legal proceedings that could reshape how private equity firms operated within the healthcare industry. Meridian's legal strategy involved challenging the financial arrangements that had given private equity investors operational control over medical facilities, arguing that such arrangements violated federal healthcare regulations and fiduciary responsibilities to patients and communities served by those facilities. Sarah's testimony about how investor-driven policies had affected patient care and employee welfare would provide crucial evidence for demonstrating that private equity involvement had created systematic violations of healthcare law and professional ethics. The scope of Meridian's legal challenge extended far beyond Sarah's individual case to encompass fundamental questions about healthcare ownership and control that could affect how medical services were delivered throughout the United States. His willingness to risk his personal fortune and business empire to challenge private equity involvement in healthcare suggested either genuine commitment to healthcare reform or sophisticated business strategy designed to eliminate competitor influence and regain market control. Sarah's decision to cooperate with Meridian's legal battle required careful consideration of the competing interests and potential consequences involved in choosing sides between a billionaire healthcare executive and private equity investors who controlled significant portions of the American medical system. Her military training had taught her to evaluate strategic situations carefully and to consider how individual actions could contribute to larger objectives that served broader public interests. The conversation with Meridian lasted several hours, during which he provided detailed information about his company's financial structure, the legal strategies he was pursuing against private equity investors, and the potential impact of successful litigation on healthcare delivery throughout his network of facilities. His explanations revealed the complex relationships between healthcare corporations, investment firms, and regulatory authorities that determined how medical services were organized and delivered in contemporary America. Meridian's offer to Sarah included not only reinstatement and compensation for her suspension, but also a senior position within his corporate structure that would give her authority to implement reforms designed to prevent the kind of treatment she had experienced and to ensure that military veterans and other dedicated healthcare workers received the respect and support they deserved. His proposal represented an opportunity to transform her personal experience into systematic change that could benefit thousands of healthcare workers and millions of patients. The meeting concluded with Meridian's commitment to providing Sarah with legal protection and financial security, while she decided whether to cooperate with his legal battle against private equity investors, recognizing that such cooperation would likely involve significant personal risk and professional consequences. Regardless of the litigation's ultimate outcome, his offer of protection and support demonstrated either genuine concern for her welfare or sophisticated understanding of what would be required to secure her cooperation in challenging powerful financial interests. As Thomas Meridian departed in his convoy of Rolls-Royce vehicles, Sarah realized that her suspension from Denver General Hospital had evolved into involvement in legal and financial battles that could reshape American healthcare delivery and determine whether medical services would be controlled by healthcare professionals committed to patient care or by financial investors focused primarily on profit maximization and market returns. The transformation of her individual employment dispute into a broader conflict between healthcare mission and financial interests represented exactly the kind of strategic challenge that her military training had prepared her to address, requiring careful analysis of competing objectives and systematic implementation of tactics designed to achieve long-term strategic success while minimizing risks to personal welfare and professional integrity. The weeks following Thomas Meridian's unexpected visit transformed Sarah's modest apartment into an unofficial command center for what legal experts were beginning to describe as one of the most significant challenges to private equity control of American healthcare in recent history. Her kitchen table, which had once held simple meals and nursing journals, now displayed complex financial documents, legal briefs, and regulatory filings that mapped the intricate web of corporate relationships controlling hospitals across multiple states. Sarah's collaboration with Meridian's legal team had begun with extensive interviews designed to document every aspect of her experience at Denver General. But the investigation had quickly expanded to encompass systematic analysis of private equity influence throughout the healthcare industry. Attorney Margaret Hayes, who led Meridian's litigation strategy, explained that Sarah's case provided a perfect example of how financial engineering had replaced medical mission as the driving force behind hospital operations. The legal team's research revealed that Sentinel Capital Partners had implemented identical cost-cutting strategies at healthcare facilities throughout their portfolio, creating a standardized approach to profit maximization that ignored local community needs and individual patient circumstances. Sarah's documentation of incidents at Denver General matched patterns observed at Meridian facilities across the country, suggesting coordinated implementation of policies designed to extract maximum financial returns while minimizing operational expenses. Hayes explained that private equity firms had developed sophisticated methods for gaining operational control of healthcare facilities without technically owning them, using complex debt arrangements and management contracts that allowed them to dictate policies while avoiding direct responsibility for patient care outcomes. These arrangements had created a shadow healthcare system where financial decisions were made by investors who had no medical training and no direct accountability to patients or communities. Sarah's role in the litigation involved providing testimony about how these financial arrangements had affected daily operations at Denver General, but her involvement had also created opportunities to influence broader healthcare policy through congressional testimony and regulatory proceedings that were examining private equity involvement in medical services. Her military background and clinical experience gave her credibility that policy experts and politicians found compelling when discussing healthcare reform initiatives. The congressional hearings on private equity and healthcare had been scheduled in response to growing public concern about hospital closures, service reductions, and quality problems at facilities controlled by investment firms. Sarah's testimony before the House Subcommittee on Health provided lawmakers with specific examples of how financial strategies had compromised patient care and created working conditions that drove experienced medical professionals away from healthcare careers. Her appearance before Congress had been preceded by extensive preparation with policy experts who helped her translate her clinical observations into language that lawmakers and the general public could understand. The testimony focused on specific incidents where cost-cutting measures had delayed patient care, reduced staffing below safe levels, and eliminated services that communities depended on for emergency medical treatment. Congressional representatives from both political parties expressed concern about Sarah's testimony, particularly her description of how private equity policies had affected military veterans who sought care at Meridian facilities. The bipartisan interest in her story reflected growing political awareness that healthcare had become a critical issue for voters who were experiencing the consequences of corporate consolidation and profit-driven medical services. The media attention generated by Sarah's congressional testimony had attracted support from advocacy organizations representing healthcare workers, military veterans, and patient rights groups who viewed her case as symbolic of broader problems affecting American medical services. These organizations provided additional resources for challenging private equity control of healthcare, while creating political pressure for regulatory reform and legislative action. Rodriguez's investigative reporting had evolved into a comprehensive series of articles examining private equity involvement in healthcare throughout the United States, with Sarah's story serving as the central narrative that illustrated broader systemic problems. The newspaper series had attracted national attention and had been cited by policy experts, academic researchers, and government officials who were developing responses to corporate consolidation of medical services. The impact of media coverage and congressional attention had created significant pressure on Sentinel Capital Partners and other private equity firms involved in healthcare investments, with several firms announcing voluntary reforms designed to address concerns about patient care and employee treatment. However, Meridian's legal team argued that voluntary reforms were insufficient and that fundamental changes in healthcare financing and ownership were necessary to protect public health and community access to medical services. Sarah's personal transformation during this period had been as dramatic as the legal and political changes surrounding her case. The shy trauma nurse, who had been humiliated in a hospital cafeteria, had become a confident advocate for healthcare reform, who spoke before congressional committees and appeared on national television programs to discuss private equity involvement in medical services. The financial security provided by Meridian's legal settlement had eliminated the immediate economic pressures that had contributed to her cafeteria incident. But Sarah had discovered that her real motivation was not personal financial gain, but rather the opportunity to create systematic changes that would benefit other healthcare workers and patients who were experiencing similar problems throughout the private equity healthcare network. Her new position within Meridian Healthcare's corporate structure gave her authority to implement employee protection policies and patient care standards that prevented the kind of cost-cutting measures that had created problems at Denver General. The role combined her clinical expertise with her growing understanding of healthcare policy and corporate governance, creating opportunities to influence medical services delivery at both individual and systematic levels. The employee protection policies that Sarah helped develop included financial assistance programs for healthcare workers experiencing temporary economic difficulties, professional development opportunities that supported career advancement rather than simply cost reduction, and formal procedures for reporting concerns about patient care without fear of retaliation. These policies were implemented throughout Meridian's network of facilities as part of the legal settlement with private equity investors. Sarah's work with regulatory authorities had also contributed to new federal guidelines governing private equity involvement in healthcare, including requirements for transparency about ownership structures, public reporting of patient care metrics, and community input on service changes that affected local medical access. These regulatory changes represented the most significant healthcare policy reforms in decades and had been directly influenced by evidence and testimony that Sarah had provided. The legal victory against Sentinel Capital Partners had resulted in the private equity firm's divestment from healthcare investments and had created precedents that other healthcare corporations were using to challenge similar investment arrangements. The settlement had also established a compensation fund for employees and patients who had been harmed by private equity policies, providing financial relief while creating accountability for corporate decisions that prioritize profit over patient care. Sarah's advocacy work had expanded beyond her collaboration with Meridian to include speaking engagements at medical schools nursing programs, and policy conferences where future healthcare professionals were learning about the importance of maintaining medical mission in corporate environments. Her message emphasized that healthcare workers had both professional and ethical obligations to protect patient care from financial interests that could compromise medical services. The transformation of Denver General Hospital following the legal settlement had been dramatic, with significant improvements in staffing levels, employee compensation, and patient care resources that demonstrated how healthcare facilities could operate successfully while prioritizing medical mission over profit maximization. The hospital had become a model for other institutions seeking to balance financial sustainability with community service and professional satisfaction. Sarah's relationship with her former colleagues at Denver General had evolved from sympathy and support during her suspension to respect and admiration for her role in creating systematic changes that improved working conditions and patient care throughout the hospital. Many of the nurses and physicians who had witnessed her humiliation in the cafeteria now viewed her as a hero who had risked her career to challenge powerful interests and create meaningful reform. The anniversary of her suspension had been marked by a ceremony at Denver General recognizing her contributions to healthcare reform and employee protection, with Thomas Meridian presenting her with a formal apology for the corporate policies that had led to her mistreatment. The ceremony included the announcement of the Sarah Martinez Healthcare Worker Protection Fund, which would provide assistance to medical professionals facing similar challenges throughout the healthcare industry. Dr. Morrison, the supervisor, who had initiated Sarah's suspension, had resigned from Denver General following the investigation into private equity influence at the hospital. Her departure had been accompanied by implementation of new supervisory training programs designed to ensure that employee discipline focused on professional development rather than public humiliation, and that financial difficulties were addressed through support services rather than punitive action. The seeing stone that Sarah had inherited from her symbolic journey now held different meaning as a reminder of her transformation from victim to advocate and her role in creating changes that extended far beyond her individual circumstances. The small object represented the power of individual courage to challenge systematic problems and create opportunities for meaningful reform that served broader public interests. Sarah's story had become required reading in healthcare administration programs and business schools, where future leaders were learning about the importance of maintaining ethical standards while managing complex corporate organizations. Her experience demonstrated how individual integrity and professional commitment could create systematic changes that protected both employee welfare and patient care from financial interests that might otherwise compromise medical mission. B. Ongoing legal and regulatory changes initiated by Sarah's case continued to evolve, with additional reforms addressing private equity involvement in other essential services, including education, housing, and utilities. Her advocacy had contributed to broader discussions about corporate responsibility and public accountability that extended far beyond healthcare to encompass fundamental questions about the role of financial markets in delivering services that communities depended on for their welfare and security. The personal growth that Sarah had experienced during her transformation from suspended nurse to healthcare advocate had prepared her for continued leadership in addressing systematic problems affecting American medical services. Her unique combination of clinical expertise, military training, and policy experience positioned her to continue influencing healthcare reform through both corporate leadership and public advocacy that served the broader mission of protecting patient care and supporting healthcare professionals who dedicated their careers to serving others.